Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 September Wikimedia Research Showcase. I'm Martin Gerlach from the Wikimedia Research Team. I'll be hosting the showcase today. We will focus today on knowledge gaps. The research team recently completed the first draft of the Taxonomy of Knowledge gaps, and there is an ongoing feedback collection for this. And as part of this, we want to spend the first 20 minutes or so today to give you a high-level overview on the taxonomy, the idea and the motivation and the general structure. And following that, we will use the remainder of the time, around 30 or 40 minutes, for an extended Q&A in which we would like to get your feedback, answer any questions you might have around the taxonomy, or discuss knowledge gaps more generally. As always, you can ask your questions via the chat on YouTube or on IRC. I'll be monitoring the channels and relay the questions to the team. And without further ado, I think Leila will kick us off.
Cool. Thank you so much, Martin. Miriam, I'll wait for you to share the slides.
Yes, does this work?
Yes, yeah. Okay. We see you. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Leila Zia. I'm the head of research here. I'm going to be talking very briefly with you about some of the framing around the work around the taxonomy of knowledge gaps for Wikimedia projects. And I'll pass the work to Miriam and Isaac and Martin to talk with you more about the meat of the work and what has been done. Miriam, if you can go to the next slide, please. So what is the motivation and what is the problem statement? Our goal in general is to empower people to share in the sum of knowledge with the Wikimedia projects. The challenge that we have faced within the research team as we think about sharing in, empowering people to share in the sum of knowledge, is that we realize we don't have a shared definition of what is knowledge and what is sharing in mean. Sharing in has multiple components to it. Part of it is around the process of knowledge production and empowering people to come in and actually participate in the production of knowledge and the documentation of knowledge. And part of it is around access. And of course, part of it is around content itself. Once we realize that we do not have a shared definition of knowledge gaps and the knowledge that we have on the Wikimedia projects, we also realize that this has other effects on the work that we do within the research team at Wikimedia Foundation, but also outside of our team. Some of the decisions that we make are at best suboptimal, because what happens is that we don't see the full spectrum of knowledge gaps that exist in the Wikimedia projects. And because we don't also fully understand the relationship between the different types of gaps, we are not always able to find where is the best place to invest our efforts in. Plus, because we don't have standard and agreed upon ways to measure the gaps and understand what the knowledge gaps are, it is very hard to create any kind of measurements on top of these gaps, which makes it then hard to be able to say, we have invested time on a project or an effort for 5 years. Did we actually make progress, or how much progress we've made to help close the gaps? We have proposed a solution. This solution we proposed in 2019, and we are now basically in the execution stage of the different stages of the solution. The solution was, the final step is developing a knowledge gap index, an index that is going to help us measure what are the different gaps across the Wikimedia projects, what is the relationships between them. We have broken down this work to multiple stages. The first stage is developing a taxonomy of knowledge gaps, and that's what's going to be the focus of the presentation today. Once we have a taxonomy of knowledge gap that is going to tell us what are the different groups of gaps that exist in Wikimedia projects, we're going to embark on developing and gathering metrics for measuring these different gap types. At the same time, we will try to understand what are the relationships between these gaps. And then we get to a place that we have to define targets for closing these gaps. And eventually, we can develop a composite index down the road where we can measure the gaps, maybe across languages or maybe across some other unit. So where are we now? What we're proposing in this, in the next 20 minutes or so, is that a definition of what constitutes a knowledge gaps. We have also developed a taxonomy of knowledge gaps, a grouping of the different gaps that exist across Wikimedia projects, and the team is going to present this to you. What we're seeking from you is feedback to help us improve this work. We're actively collecting feedback until the end of September, and we hope to spend the fall on iterating on the feedback, improving the taxonomy, and hopefully finalizing it. I'll say one last thing, which is the bottom of the slides, and it's something that is really core to the work that we do. Our core principle is that while we're working towards developing a knowledge gap index, the process that we use for getting to that index is as important, if not more important, than getting the index itself. There's going to be a lot of learning through iterations that we do with you, and we hope to learn from you and also help you understand better our perspective and learn from us. We are seeking active collaboration, feedback, radical ideation. Every idea is welcome, and we would like to hear from you. Please keep engaging with us, and we are committed to do this work with you and for you. Well, with that, I'm going to pass it to Miriam to kick us off with the more meaty part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. So hi, my name is Miriam. I'm a senior scientist in the team. And what I am going to talk about in the next few minutes is basically how the thought process and the rationale behind building the knowledge gaps taxonomy. And to start on this journey, let me start with a principle which is very familiar for most of us in the Wikimedia movement. Knowledge equity is one of the two principles driving the 2030 Wikimedia movement strategy, and is essentially encouraging all of us to include in Wikimedia projects those knowledge and communities that have been left out by structures of power and privilege, and also pushing us to break down the social, political, and technical barriers and to bridge those gaps which prevent people from accessing free knowledge. And so while all of us are working towards reaching this goal, what the research, as Leila said, what the research team thought it would be nice to have is a way to progress the track, to track the progress, towards reaching this goal, towards reaching knowledge equity. In order to have this way of measuring our progress towards knowledge equity, we need to first do something called operationalize knowledge equity. Essentially, operationalizing means breaking down the complex concept of knowledge equity into those individual components, those individual gaps where we essentially record inequality, and that prevents us from reaching knowledge equity. And so by identifying those gaps, we can then build on top of it and track our progress towards the goal of knowledge equity. Just to give you an example of the gaps that we're talking about, this is an example that has been well studied by most researchers and practitioners, and this example gap is the gender gap. The gender gap has been studied as being evident across different components of the Wikimedia movement. Only 20% of the biographies in average are about female, and about 70% of the page views of our readers are from men. And so the gender gap has been well defined, has been well quantified, but there must be, and there are other areas of Wikimedia movement and other dimensions across which we have evidence of inequality. And so these other areas are exactly the gaps that we are trying to find and collect and classify with our taxonomy. So the aim of the taxonomy is to go beyond the study of gender gap, which is extremely important, and try and find all the other gaps and classify them in a structured way that we can find in the Wikimedia movement. As Leila said, one of the contributions that we have is also to define what we understand as a knowledge gap. The definition of knowledge gap for us is a disparity with respect to coverage for a specific group of reader, contributors of content across Wikimedia projects. So for example, the gender gap is a disparity in terms of content coverage for different gender groups, or a disparity in terms of representation of different gender groups in readers. And so our task was to essentially read tons of literature to identify all the gaps in Wikimedia spaces that fits this definition. If you're familiar with the concept of a taxonomy is like a tree, where the roots of the tree are the coarsest grain category of the word you're trying to classify, and the leaves are finer grain properties of the roots of the tree. And so the first step to build this taxonomy was to identify the roots of our tree, the pillars of the Wikimedia movement that we will analyze to find knowledge gaps. And I'm going to skip how we find them, but basically we identify the root dimensions of our taxonomy as the three main areas in Wikimedia spaces: content, readers, and contributors. And then the next step is to basically grow the taxonomy, grow each branch of this taxonomy by finding knowledge gaps related to content, readers, and contributors. Essentially, how we find those knowledge gaps is that for each of the root dimensions, readers, content, and contributors, we do a huge literature review, and we find elements with evidence of knowledge inequality, which we identify as knowledge gaps, and then we classify them into a structured taxonomy. Just to mention a little bit the type of literature that we are looking at when we develop this taxonomy, there are three main types of sources that we analyze to identify knowledge gaps. The first one is academic literature. We look at what researchers in academia have been studied in terms of knowledge gaps in Wikimedia spaces, from computer science to communication sciences and social sciences. We look at all the movement strategy directions and the initiatives that have been generated and have been grown throughout the years to face specific knowledge inequalities in Wikimedia spaces. And finally, we look at all those surveys that the Wikimedia Foundation and affiliates have been run throughout the years to understand the composition of the different Wikimedia communities. So these are our three sources based on which we identify this knowledge gap. And I will pass it now to Martin, who is going to tell us a little bit about the structure of the taxonomy and the content of the taxonomy itself.
Thank you, Miriam. Yes, so I will try to walk you through the general structure of the taxonomy. In the interest of time, I will not go into every single detail of the 35 gaps that we identified, but I will try to give a high-level overview of what are the different aspects that we are trying to capture with this taxonomy. And as you can see here, the starting point are the three root dimensions in the Wikimedia ecosystem in which we think knowledge gaps appear. These are readers, contributors, and content. Yes, next slide, please. For each dimension, we have a collection of gaps, each referring to a different type of gap or a different aspect. And for the next slide, please. In order to organize these in a bit more systematic way and not just have a list of different gaps, we introduce a middle layer, which we call facets. And these facets, these group gaps that are similar in terms of their properties, or they capture or have different objectives. Now I try to go through each dimension and quickly mention each gaps. So for starting with the reader dimension, that captures gaps related to the consumption of Wikimedia content when directly accessing the site. This is what we understand. And this covers in total 3 facets. And next slide, please. For the first facet, this is the sociodemographic facet. And this captures differences in the number of readers with respect to different social status, demographics, or cultural background. This is motivated by the fact that we know from a number of different surveys and academic studies that there are substantial differences in participation with respect to gender, education, age, geography, and many, many different more indicators. Next slide, please. The second facet refers to accessibility, and this captures barriers that prevent individuals who would like to read Wikipedia from accessing the content. One example here is technical barriers such as internet connectivity. So we know that internet costs can be a substantial barrier to the online access of Wikimedia content, in particular through mobile devices. And one indication for the importance of this is the popularity of tools such as Kiwix, which aim to make it easier to read Wikipedia content offline. But it's not just restricted to that. There's other examples, other aspects such as technical skills, where we know that high internet skills are associated with an increase in online participation, devices, or even disabilities such as blindness. Next slide, please. The third facet in the reader dimension refers to the information need. And this captures differences in the reasons why people come to the site. And for example, from recent research, we know on why we read Wikipedia, we know that people are motivated by a very wide number of reasons to actually visit Wikimedia sites. This can be intrinsic learning, current events, even if you're bored, or because you want to do homework or schoolwork. Other aspects that are captured here is desired information depth can vary, or even the familiarity with the subject. From this, I want to briefly, only the next slide, please. If we go to the contributors section, the contributors dimension, I think it's the next slide. I will touch this only very briefly because the contributors dimension, in contrast to readers, it captures the gaps related to the people that are contributing to the site. It very much mirrors the reader dimension, but instead of the information need facet, we introduced a facet related to the motivation of editors. And this captures the different reasons for editing, and as a result, also the different ways in which editors might contribute to the site, whether they are copy editing or fact-checking or many other different reasons and roles they take. With this, I want to come to the third and final dimension, the content dimensions. Similarly, we also have three facets here. And the content gap also reflects the absence, incompleteness, or biases of the content on Wikimedia projects. For the first facet is the policy facet, and this captures to which degree articles are consistent with the core content policies in Wikipedia. And specifically, we want to capture lack of neutral point of view in order to avoid biases, which are very well documented. And also the availability of reliable resources in articles in order to ensure the verifiability of the content. And we know that articles on Wikipedia only fulfill this to varying degrees, these different categories. Next slide, please. The second facet relates to the diversity of content, and this captures coverage of different topics in Wikipedia, especially knowledge that is underrepresented, marginalized, and or locally relevant. Perhaps here, coming back to the example that Miriam gave, the most well-documented gap is the content gap with respect to gender. That is certainly one particular gap, but there are many, many more. These can be related to geography or to cultural context. And I want to point out that this list of relevant topics here is by no means comprehensive and potentially even open-ended. There's no final solution which topics should be included here. And with this, I want to come to the third facet, which relates to the accessibility, capturing how accessible the available content is. One aspect here is the readability of text. So it is very well documented, very well established, that the reading difficulty is considerably above the reading ability of average adults. And this holds even if to a lesser degree for projects like Simple English Wikipedia, which are actually explicitly aimed to closing such a gap. I want to stress that readability is one aspect. Other gaps relate to multimedia, availability of multimedia content, such as images, which are potentially important for younger age groups or non-native speakers. And the other aspect is the availability of structured data. So for example, through Wikidata, which allows to manage knowledge on a global scale and across languages. And with this, I want to go to the next slide. This is the taxonomy, a brief overview on the structure. With this, I want to conclude this very coarse view and pass it on to Isaac, who will say a little bit more about the intricacies here.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I'm Isaac, a research scientist with the team. So before I wrap up the presentation, I wanted to discuss a little bit something that we don't go into the paper, but that's the relationship between gaps in the three dimensions of reader, content, and contributors. So first, the relationship between contributors and content. This is pretty well studied. So we know due to self-focus bias, people tend to write about topics that are relevant to their identity. And so when the contributor population is not representative of the broader world, we also tend to end up with associated gaps in the content. So without even describing it, many of you might recognize this as a map of the geographic distribution of Wikimedia content, specifically a map of Wikidata items and where they are in the world. And it shows the self-focus bias. As you can see, the content on Wikidata is heavily concentrated in North America and Europe, where many of the contributors to the Wikimedia projects also are. Next slide. And if we take a step back, what about the relationship between readership gaps and contributor gaps? So in a 2018 paper titled The Pipeline of Online Participation Inequalities, Aaron Shaw and Esther Hargitay laid out a model for how inequalities arise in the editor population, noting that while retainment of editors likely plays a role in gaps of representation like gender, the gaps generally appear at earlier stages or prerequisites to editing, like having internet access, being aware of Wikipedia, being a reader, and knowing that it's possible to contribute to Wikipedia. And so this model tells us because of structural inequalities and additional barriers that arise between being a reader and being an editor, the reader population will almost always be more representative of the world than the editor population without any sorts of specific interventions to push back against that. Next slide. And from the readership surveys that we ran last year, we also have evidence of a relationship between content and readership. Now, this isn't necessarily that content gaps create readership gaps, but we do see that readers tend to read about topics that are relevant to their identity. So women are more likely than men to read articles about women. Younger readers are more likely to read articles about younger people than older readers. People tend to read articles about the countries where they're located, and so on. Next slide. And together, these relationships show the importance of not just understanding each of these individual dimensions, contributors, readers, content, and the facets and gaps within them, but also the interdependencies between them, as that's going to help us understand how to best address the gaps that we do see. Next slide. Yeah, so the credits for all the images that we used in this presentation. Also note that there's, I think, over 200 references in the report that we put together, which speaks to the amount of work that has been done and that we're able to build on for building this taxonomy. And finally, close our presentation of the first draft of the Knowledge Gaps taxonomy. On this slide, you'll see two links. They actually go to the same place. But this is where you can read more about each of the gaps and the sources we use to compile this information. And this is also a good place to leave feedback. There's a talk page where you can share or other manners of sharing feedback with us there. And so with that, I'll say thank you.
Okay, then I think with this, the presentation from our side is concluded. We're just slightly over time. That's slightly longer than we planned. That's very good. And with this, I would ask you we have around half an hour of time from our side to engage, have a Q&A and answer your questions or simply discuss. Please add them to the YouTube chat or IRC. I'm going through it at the moment. I'll start to pass them down, and I will start with questions about religious gaps. I think the question was, what is our coverage of Muslims, Sikhs, or Mormons? How do and the other, yeah, maybe we start with this. So I think this is related, as I understand, to the content of these religious groups. I think maybe equally, I would add the question in terms of readers or contributors, if we capture this, or do we have a way to know this? I don't know if someone can answer this.
Yeah, I can take that one. So there have been a couple surveys in the past that have asked about things like religion, but it's not a common one. So from the readers or contributors side, we don't have a lot of data. And I think religious gaps are one of these things, and this is true of a lot of different things. So religion, ethnicity, kind of political leanings, things that we definitely see as probably important and relevant for gaps. But at least in this initial taxonomy, we're kind of stymied by two things, one being the availability of data about these. So for religion, for instance, there's not necessarily a great way, you could use categories, but there's not a great way necessarily to map content to religion. For readers and contributors, like I said, there's not a whole lot of surveys. And so, there's always going to be additional gaps we can add to the taxonomy. And for something like religion, I think we do mention it kind of in passing and what we know about it. But because of the lack of data on it and kind of the challenges of doing surveys or things like that at a global scale around religion, we held off from making it a main facet.
I would add here in terms of content, one could potentially add this as an indicator, the coverage of people of different religious groups. I'm not sure if this is not the focus now. As I said, the coverage of individual topics, this is not an exhaustive list that we provided. That is potentially also context dependent for which community is interested in which topic. I'm not sure if the Wikidata human gender indicators, if they capture coverage of people with a religion. I think they do, but I'm not 100% sure. And this could be done by looking for articles with given properties in Wikidata. But yeah, that's as much as I can add here. I don't know if anyone else wants to add something to the question. And as a second follow-up question, it was asked, how do our contributors represent our readers?
Sorry, Ryan, can you repeat that?
The question was, how do our contributors represent our readers? I do think we know some aspects of this, for example, around the gender gap. This is something I have in mind, how this differs from contributors to readers. In general, I don't know. Do you?
Yeah, so that's what with the Shaw and Hargitai's work around the pipeline. Essentially, they're saying that any barrier that prevents someone from being a reader probably also adds to the challenge of them then converting to a contributor on the on any of the Wikimedia projects. So for almost every gap where we have data, and gender is kind of the best example of this, what we see is we see a gap often appear at the readership stage, and then that gap become much larger when it comes to the contributor population. So yeah.
Great, thanks.
I can add to that.
Oh.
Can I just add something to that? I remember in the same paper that Isaac mentioned that also, and I think we got this as one of the feedback points for the taxonomy, is that also the awareness that you can become a contributor varies depending on the category you belong to. So, for example, varies across genders, as far as I remember. So there is also this component of actually knowing that anyone can edit, and that if you're a reader, you can become a contributor. That plays a very important role in this transition.
Another question that I picked up in the chat was whether we have considered time as a barrier. And as I understood, I'm trying to see if that was related to readers or contributors. That's what I understood. 1 second. For extracurricular activities. So yeah, how much time we have for volunteer or extracurricular activities.
I can take that as well. So with time, we have considered it, and I think there's two aspects to this. One is, is availability of time. Do we see that as something that correlates with these gaps? And there's certainly data around the world that would suggest that availability of time can be kind of a contributing factor. On the other hand, we also see plenty of other platforms where this, like for instance with gender, right? We see plenty of platforms on the internet where women are contributing more than men. So I don't want to use time availability as like that is the reason why. I think it's definitely part of the answer, but there are counter examples that would suggest it's certainly not the full picture.
I'd like to add something as a complement to what Isaac just mentioned. As we are thinking about time, we thought about time and some of the other potential causes for some of the gaps that we are seeing. And the current taxonomy is not listing so much the causes. So at some point when we are thinking about the gaps and how to intervene or how to address them, we need to come back to the bigger question of why these gaps are happening and what are the best ways as movement or as particular parts of the Wikimedia movement we want to start tackling particular causes. I put currently time as not a gap in knowledge, but as potentially a cause or something that correlates with some of the other gap types that we are heavily correlates potentially with some of the other gap types that we're considering. It's an important point and needs to be considered. I would put it more as like a potentially cause category that we need to come back to when we think about interventions.
Next question. Are you just looking at English Wikipedia or a few language projects or the movement as a whole?
Maybe I can take this one. So the hope would be to evolve the taxonomy so that we can include all areas of the movement that we collectively think they should be included. There are some gaps that might be focused in especially, for example, the policy gap is based on two of the main core content policies in Wikipedia, right? So this is a little bit more Wikipedia focused. We are welcoming suggestions on how to expand this to other Wikimedia projects that are where we find evidences of inequality. We try to be as neutral and inclusive as possible. But obviously it also reflects, so what we might find in the taxonomy might also reflect the coverage in terms of gaps by the three sources that we have read. So if there is anything we have missed and that we should definitely add, there are the feedback form is there to welcome your feedback. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything on top of that. It's the objective definitely was not to work on English Wikipedia only, and not only on Wikipedia.
I will add maybe just to reinforce your message, Miriam, and I will say this, given that a few hours ago we got also a comment on the meta page around, it seems the tone of the paper or parts of it is written in a way that gives the impression that the focus can be on English Wikipedia. I've had a follow-up question for user Yair Rand, who brought that up to understand better which parts of the work is suggesting this, because as Miriam said, we actively want to do differently, and we want to include not only different Wikipedia languages, but different Wikipedia projects. Particularly, I would say Wikisource, Wikimedia Commons, and Wikidata on top of Wikipedia are projects that highly interact with Wikipedia in terms of content and richness of content. So I would say at least we would like to see more comprehensive look at all these 4 projects and potentially more. One thing I will say is that potentially there's bias from our perspective when we come to the projects. As you know, a lot of the work that Wikimedia Foundation has done over the years has been focused on Wikipedia. So certainly we're coming from an environment where Wikipedia has been kind of the background and the focus. So this is something we are aware of, that these types of questions also remind us of that, and maybe that awareness can help us go back and try to improve parts of the content. But I will say, if you specifically notice areas that can be improved, please call out in the meta page or on IRC or here. The other thing I will say, and again, this was my question to Yair Rand as well, the notion that the focus is on English Wikipedia may also come from the place that a lot of the sources that we use refer to English Wikipedia, although the team has done a really great job trying to find community efforts that are outside of English Wikipedia as well. Given that a lot of academic literature traditionally had been focused on English Wikipedia, you may see some of that correlation as well. Again, this is something that our team is actively working on to break. English Wikipedia is great, and we want to continue supporting it, but we also want to continue supporting more other languages and other projects. So I'll say you see this throughout a lot of the efforts that we have within the team. Our focus is coming out of one language only and try to have a more comprehensive look. Because of the past and because of our own biases, we will fail at points. So keep reminding us, keep asking questions, help us improve it.
I have a follow-up questions here that Miriam, you were mentioning different ways to try and detect knowledge gaps automatically rather than guessing that they exist and then seeing if they are true. Could you comment more about that?
Yeah, if I understood the question is about the essentially where we go from there and how we detect automatically some of these gaps, right? Is Martin what the question was about?
Sorry, can you repeat? I was just skimming
sorry. If the question is about how to basically go from there and detect some of these gaps automatically.
Yes, this is how I understood it. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a super interesting area, and this is definitely one of the things that is in our radar in the future. The taxonomy was basically, as Leila said, a necessary step to have a systematic definition or towards a systematic definition of the space of knowledge gaps. We couldn't detect anything automatically without having this systematic definition. You cannot teach anything to a machine if you don't understand it first in a systematic way. So that was the first step. The next step would be to, for some of these gaps, when measurable, when there are evidences that we could potentially be able to measure the gaps. For example, what people have done for the gender gap. The map that Isaac showed somehow was a reflection of the geographic gap of in Wikidata, right? So for some of these gaps, we are able to turn them into a metric using a computational approach. For example, for the gender gap, the percentage of female biographies, the percentage of women readers. And so this step of turning the definition of a gap into a metric is part of the research that we are doing this fiscal year, which means something for people at the Wikimedia Foundation, but basically means until the end of June 2021. So we are going to work and trying to see, also hopefully with collaborators from academia, to see how easy it is to turn some of this gap into a quantity, so that we can then in the future have some ways to display our progress towards bridging those gaps. I hope I answered this question. There is not much work that people have done yet. One of the best examples of people having worked on quantifying knowledge gaps in content is the diversity observatory from UPF and EURECAT from Mark Mikkel. I can send links. I can put the links in the YouTube chat. And this is basically a dashboard showing, for example, the number of articles specific to a culture, of a specific culture in a given Wikipedia, or the number of women and men, articles about women and men. So these kind of initiatives, these are the ones that we would like to support and expand in the future.
Great, thank you, Miriam. I have a perhaps related question here, which maybe it's a comment, maybe it's a question. It is about, one question is whether we plan to upload the taxonomy to Wikidata so that it could be sustained efficiently. And I think, so that is certainly possible. And I think the connection is, as a clarification point, because then one could enrich this taxonomy automatically with the use of other structured data from other structured data, or from topic models, or from other publications that are included in these databases. It is certain, like, I think it's a very, from my side, if I want to comment, I should comment. I think this is a very good suggestions. From what I understand, we have not done that yet, but we could think about this actually very good idea. And it's related to that question about automatically enriching these gaps or finding these gaps. If anyone else wants to chime in.
I will say two things that one is tangentially potentially related, but helpful context. One is that the comment around connecting the taxonomy to Wikidata has also come up in the feedback we have received on the meta page so far. So if the person who brought it up right now is not the same person, we have at least 2 requests now around this. Definitely something we should look into and see what the shape and form of this can be. In terms of how the taxonomy will be used, the questions and conversations around the measurement of the different types of gaps, but also how we operationalize. Once we know this is the type of gap, how are we going to start signaling to the organizers, to the editors, that these are the types of gaps and these are the places you may want to start pick up and address the gaps. That's the part that our team intends to work really closely with the organizer and editor communities, plus the experts within Wikimedia Foundation who focus on design research and the design of tools and dashboards that can help communicate this kind of work. Because there is one thing around, having a rigorous taxonomy developed that we can all, to a good extent, understand, relate to, and align our work with. And there's something else about visualizing and making that data available in an operationalizable way to people who actually are on the ground and can benefit from this knowledge. And I would say that part of the work is the part of the work we're not talking about right now in depth in this session, but is key to the success of the usefulness of this work at the end, right? And this is something I want to say, we are committed as a team to work within the organization and also with the editors and organizers and people who are going to be the users of such a dashboard to make sure that the dashboard surfaces what is useful for them to get out of this work.
One quick question comes about, I guess it says, isn't there an assumption that women are underrepresented, therefore content on women is lacking? I guess this relates to the gender content gap.
The question is not super clear to me, Isaac, if you have picked it up. No, Martin, maybe we can ask some clarifying question. It is not clear to me whether the question is, do we as a team who has developed the taxonomy assumes that there is a relationship between gender of content versus gender of contributor, or the question is asking something else?
From here, I cannot say. I would answer that. So I assume that one could answer on both sides, whether we make that assumption or whether that assumption is always explicitly made, or whether that is true. And that could be made for any content. I guess gender is the reason why I'm bringing it up, is that this studying these gaps could be in any coverage when we talk about underrepresented. How we make this assumption, how confident are we about it?
Sorry, I may be slow. Is the question that, is there topical preferences or area preferences depending for contribution, depending on which category the contributors are coming from? Is there a relationship between the type of content contributed and the type of contributor who is in?
I'm not sure how I can say how I understand is the question is, we talk about a gender content gap and whether there is a gender gap, a gap on content about gender. That is what I understand the question.
Isaac, do you want to comment on that? I can maybe just say something at a high level, and if anyone else would like to add to this, by all means, please do. When it comes to gender and content, my understanding from what exists in the literature is that we can at least do some coarse measurements around at the level of the article. So suppose the existence of an article, forget about the completeness. Whether an article exists about a woman or a non-binary person, and compared to the articles that exist about men. And in that sense, you can see that there are way fewer articles about women and non-binary in Wikipedia than when you compare it to articles about men. Now, obviously, there are ongoing conversations that there are clearly historical reasons for the availability of verifiable sources and all of those conversations that I'm well aware of. However, and this goes, I would actually like to hear from the community members who are active in this space if we have people on the call. But it is the case that there are many women who could be on Wikipedia today who are not, whose biographies are not on Wikipedia, and there are projects who are actively working in this space to address this.
Follow-up question is about, maybe not so follow-up, not directly follow-up, but a general question, which I know we discussed, and it's a difficult one, is once we're able to turn some of the gaps into metrics, which hopefully we can, how might we judge whether the metrics are too high or too low, which I assume is about the question, or one could translate about when is the gap closed? How do we know that?
I'll say my take on this, and the team should feel free to jump in and share their perspectives. As Martin said, this is something we have discussed in the team. I don't claim that we have an answer for it. I want to differentiate between metric and target. Let's say metric is the way we measure something, and target is the goal that we want to say, once we reach that target, we're done. As an example, when you think about the gender of the content, or let's say gender of the contributors, we can say that we would like we will measure the demographics of our contributors, and we will measure basically how many people identify as men, women, non-binary, or prefer not to share. And we want to have a certain distribution over these 4 categories. Just as an example, suppose we say we want to have 48, 48, and 4% on each of these categories. Again, just as an example. Once we set this target, then we work towards addressing this target. Now, even for something as simple as the distribution over gender, we may not agree what the target should be. First of all, I want to make it clear that the research team is not in a place to define targets. We need to work with specific communities who work in specific spaces to understand what makes sense to be a target, what are our ambitions, what is the direction that we are moving towards. It also can be that the target is different from community to community. It is not very surprising to me that Wikimedia Foundation wants to have a target on a specific problem or in a specific space, and Wikimedia Deutschland or Wiki Loves Monuments decides to have a completely different target. And these can be okay. We can have different targets, but we will have a framework through which we can communicate how we're measuring, what is our target, and where we're heading. There are things can get very complicated very quickly when we start talking about targets. Just to give you a kind of a slightly more complicated example than potentially the gender example is the age example. We have a distribution over, let's say, contributors, distribution of age. Suppose we could collect that data. Suppose we could collect that data about the readers. I ask you all the question, what do you want the distribution, the target distribution of our readers be 10 years down the road? I don't have an answer for that. I think I will use the target as a point for conversation and not so much as a rigid thing that we stick to very heavily. I consider targets to be dynamic and a great point to start talk about and align where we want to invest our efforts. If we decide that, for example, 10 years down the road, we want to have 50% of our reader population to be from school kids or kids in the group of, let's say, 0 to 24 years old, we may take very different steps today to make the content more accessible to this group or more attractive to this group. We may have different strategies around how we do Wikimedia in education programs. If we decide that we want our population to be more the upper buckets of age, then we do different things today. So I will encourage us all to think about targets as points, as motivation points to come together and to talk about what is in the long run important to us. What do we want to achieve? That's my perspective. And by all means, the rest of the team should add to this. I know it's a topic that we are passionate about.
Yeah, I can mention kind of an alternative approach that might make sense for other sorts of settings. One way to frame this question is what is a kind of reasonable and flexible way to get a sense of what is the important content and how well is it covered? And one, so I mentioned earlier in the talk that readers are generally more representative of the population than editors are for, according to the pipeline of participation inequalities. And so if you take that framing and you say like, well, where should we kind of be investing our efforts? It could be in articles that get high page views, but are considered low quality. And so this is a way where you could say, okay, well, then for something like the gender gap, we can look at biographies of men and biographies of women and look at the kind of average quality of these articles and look at the kind of average page views that go to these articles. And from there, get a sense of how large in a given language edition is that gap between what the readers seem to be interested in and what content kind of currently exists and the quality of that content. And that would be another way to kind of approach this, like how do we set targets? There's a bunch of different gaps and you're going to want, like maybe different targets for each language. And this might be a way that's certainly far from perfect, but might give like a general, but like, a global view, but one that is more responsive to potentially the needs of a given community.
If there are no more things to add here, then I will continue with the next question, and I hope I understand this. There was something around the next steps for this research, and I think you mentioned a little bit in the beginning, Leila, in the roadmap. And I think one specification is about how a community could participate in and after the research.
Sure, I can take this and happy to take follow-up questions. As mentioned on the meta page, we are, until the end of September, we are collecting feedback on the taxonomy. In the month of October and November, we're going to analyze the feedback that we received. We're going to go back through the taxonomy and we're going to try to improve it based on the feedback. Then in the month of December, we're going to publish a report that is going to say, this is the feedback we received. These are the parts that we incorporated. And these are the parts that we didn't incorporate. And these are our reasonings for why we didn't incorporate it. So that kind of finalizes the first instance of the taxonomy of knowledge gap for us. And that allows us to start thinking about like the measurements. We have a commitment to the organization, this is Wikimedia Foundation, that by the end of June 2021, we propose measurements for 60% of the gaps that you see within the taxonomy today. There are 35 gaps, 60% of those. This is what we have committed to the organization. So what we're going to do starting as soon as the taxonomy is finalized, or even in parallel to that, as we see there may be parts of the taxonomy that have been more solid and we have received no feedback about. They seem to be places we can start moving forward with. We're going to start building formal collaborations with academics, researchers in academia and industry who are interested to work in this space with us. We have started having some early conversations with some labs, research labs, who can help us measure these gaps. And we're going to actively seek them between basically October to, I would say, October 2020 until like February 2021. That's the period that we're going to actively look for collaborators. We would hope to engage the research community to come and help us measure these gaps. For the community interaction part, we're starting early October with the design strategy team within Wikimedia Foundation some prototypes. Basically, they're going to work with us to help us visualize what eventually become an output of this work. We don't know all the different stages that exist before we get to that point, but we think now is a good time to start thinking about what is going to come out of this work and what the users are going to actually use, because that can inform also the type of research we do and where we put more emphasis on the research. So that work is going to happen, and I expect that work to have to happen in collaboration with the users of the tool, which partly is the community of editors and organizers, affiliates, Wikimedia Foundation, those who make decisions at the Wikimedia Foundation. We would like to continue working with the editor and organizer community on this front. I expect any of the measurement of the gaps will require further conversations with the community to make sure we are making the measurements accurately, given that the very lower branches of the taxonomy are quite specific. I am hoping that we can tap into specific community members' expertise. So for example, if you're thinking about the neutrality of content, I'm expecting to work a little bit more closely with those part of the community that focuses on neutrality particularly, and around the issues that are closely related potentially to neutrality around bias. Working with wiki projects who are active in this space. So we're going to reach out to these projects and try to actively engage them and work with them. The view is, I should say actually one last thing, that as we're doing this feedback collection, we're also reaching out to some of the affiliates to try to gather their input. If you are listening to this and you are a member of an affiliate organization or and you want to talk with us, please reach out to myself or one of us in the team. And I'll leave it at that, as that is kind of what we have thought so far. We have not seen the full picture. So if you see there are other ways that you want to engage with us, please tell us now or in the meta page. And if anyone else in the team, if I missed something that we are planning to do, please just correct me.
If not, then we have another question related to the content gap, and is whether the taxonomies, like what we label as content, or in the content, what we label as presence of articles, whether this is only related to the existence of an article, or whether we also consider other features such as quality, score, and related to that, that this in gender, this is obviously well studied, but there are other elements within the diversity that have not been well studied to that degree. So I could comment, I could give a comment on that. Yeah. So I must say we have so far, this is a taxonomy, so we have not done any measures with respect to these gaps. We are planning to do that, at least as Leila mentioned, at least for, probably not for all, but for as many as we can, we want to do these measures. This is also related to the availability of data always. So that also restricts actually in what we can measure. And starting from the gender gap in content, that it is true, maybe the most simple measure is just the presence or absence of articles. But looking in the literature, one sees that there are actually, and we have started to analyze this more systematically, that there's different components to, or different aspects of gender gap. So there's not just one content gender gap, but beyond the just presence of articles, we can look at the extent of articles. So how long are they? What is their quality score? Because otherwise we could just add a bunch of stub articles. For example, we would claim the gap is closed, but actually we would not have accomplished much. So taking a look at these other aspects of articles is actually very important. And there's a third component beyond the extent is actually the framing. So whose knowledge is contained in this, and in which way are the individuals or the places portrayed in these articles. This is something that we are studying at the moment, or have started to take a look at that. And it is not, the answer I can give here, there's no easy solution to that I think there will be a trade-off between being pragmatic, what we can measure, but not making it too simplistic that does not capture everything we want to capture. And it's true that studying that on the gender gap is actually very informative, because there has been a lot of research on that. And I think, as the person who asked the question, that is actually very informative as a recipe almost, how could this inform us to make measurements in other gap as a blueprint, and say, how could we approach this for things that have actually not been studied? And there's actually no other gap has been studied to that extent as the gender gap has been studied. So that is my short answer. Okay, Isaac, you have pointed me to.
I want to talk about the question.
While talking, I couldn't read simultaneously. So if you have the question, go ahead.
Yeah, from IRC, there's a question about the accessibility gap, and particularly the kind of readability of a given topic, like how easy is it to read, like a reading ease score, but how that might be completely inappropriate for measuring that gap, because the right level of like readability for a given topic will vary widely. And is this an area where our team thinks it might be possible to usefully measure reading ease, and if so, how? And I have thoughts about this, but I'll open it up for others if they want to respond first. So yeah, I think it's a really good question about reading ease, and I don't have a great answer for it, but I wanted to bring up a relevant point around this, which is there has been some work looking at the kind of the utility of reading machine translated articles on Wikipedia, which I think gets at this. And for that, there's certain topics they find where if you take a machine translated article, so for instance, the article is in English, and using automatic machine translation, it's translated into Arabic or Indonesian. And the question is like, is that content useful with this kind of non-human curated machine translation? And they found a variation in how useful it was depending on the topic, where things around STEM, there's less utility. And this is where I start to speculate. And I think that's because like with many STEM related topics, so things around math and physics, the language is very technical and kind of difficult sometimes to understand initially. And then when you add into that either errors in terminology or things like that, it can get even harder to read. And so I totally agree with the premise of this question, which is that the reading ease is not something that's a static level that should be applied to every article. As far as whether it's still useful to measure or like even possible to measure across topics, I don't have a great answer for that. So if other people on the team want to take that part, I'd be very happy. It looks like not. So I think it's going to be one of those things where this is something that will have to be done in conversation with the communities to see if this is and it's possible that it's not possible to do it well, and that you'll almost do more harm in coming up with metrics than you could benefit. And if that's the case, then maybe you don't make this into a metric.
So I don't see any more questions on IRC or in the chat. And I think we're also at time. So I would propose to conclude this here. If there are any follow-up questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. I want to specifically highlight the project page on Meta that contains a collection of links to all the different material, a video and a summary and the full paper, and where we also invite you to leave your feedback as on the talk and discussion page. If you would like to do that, without your name, there's also Google Forms where you can pass along the feedback privately. What else did I miss? That is, we would really appreciate until the end of the month, we are collecting this feedback and we will try to incorporate that in a revised version. So it will really help us to improve this piece of work. And with this, I want to thank everyone who listened today, to join and discussed with us. This was extremely helpful and extremely interesting to hear your perspectives on this topic. I also want to thank the speakers here with me from the research team, and also the technical support and the administrative support that we received to host this. And with this, have a great day, evening, or morning, wherever you are in the world. And we hope to see you at the next research showcase next month.